So my name is Nishad, Herath. One second. We can there. So, and this is Anders, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name because I'm pretty sure that I'll get it wrong. But, so what we're going to talk about today is actually using the hardware feature that has been present in the Intel CPUs or compatible CPUs for quite some time, but in a way that was not necessarily something that it was intended for. We're trying to talk about how we can use it for better security outcomes, rather than using it for what it was originally intended for, which was basically to collect low-level performance statistics on software that's running on the processors. So, you want to introduce yourself? You're not sure?
I think the introduction slides.
Well, okay, fair enough. If you want to just,
yeah.
Do we have some? Oh, okay. Makes it easier. All right. So, like, what we'll do is I'll give you a quick rundown of what we're going to, like, some of the aspects that we'll be looking at. So, first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a brief introduction to the hardware performance monitoring counters on the Intel CPUs. Well, I'm going to use the term Intel CPUs for the architecture because I'm like that comes naturally, but it's the same with compatible CPUs as well to a large degree. And we're going to talk about how these performance monitoring counters can be used as a detection or mitigation method for return-oriented programming. Yep. And here we won't be really talking about what we have researched into it per se, as much as we'll be pointing out at some of the things that people have done with this. And we will be talking about using the performance monitoring counters to detect and mitigate an attack, a low-level attack like RowHammer. And we will also briefly discuss what we can do against rootkits. And also, last, we'll be looking at how we can use the performance monitoring counters to basically detect and mitigate cache side tunnel attacks. So, so now to give you guys a quick background, I'm working as a principal malware technologist at Qualys, and I've been involved in reverse engineering and security for a very long time, and I mean, yeah, the rest is less important really.
Right, I'm Anders, and I'm the Vice President of Engineering and co-founder of Protect Software GmbH. I have been involved in innovation, research, and leading development teams. I'm a bit of a weirdo in this business. I have a master's degree in economics, and malware has been a hobby for me since '92. So I have a lot of experience with it. So this is why malware for me is listed as a hobby and not as a job.
So moral of the story is that hopefully we've done some convincing that we may actually know what we're talking about to some degree. Okay, so first we are going to discuss how and the why and where these performance counters really come from, right? So to get a better understanding of the features and what is possible there, the nitty-gritty differences between different core architectures, different versions, and all these things, really like the best source of information for this is the Intel manuals. And basically, these days, they pretty much document almost all of it. And it's a very good source of information when you want to start implementing some of these things. And it's only 350 pages, so you know, it's a brief. So these features have been around in the Intel x86, x64 compatible CPUs since the 1990s, the mid-90s. And the early Intel Pentium processors did have an implementation of it, which was undocumented at the time. And Turgy Matheson basically published his insights into how these things work by reverse engineering a piece of software that Intel released called EMON. And that explained how this worked in the early Intel Pentium processors. And with Intel Pentium MMX technology, so the P55C core, Intel basically came out and started offering it as a standard architectural feature. And with the Intel Pentium implementation, there were 2 performance monitoring counters, but they were implemented as model-specific registered, or MSRs, and they were both readable with RDMSR instruction, but only in ring 0. Now, when it came to the Pentium MMX, the P55C, Intel basically introduced a new instruction called RDPMC, which allowed you to read these performance monitoring counters, and you could also do it from ring 3 or any other ring, basically. And also, with the P55C, they introduced RDTSC, which is basically read timestamp counter, which does provide very high resolution timestamping information for the Intel processors. And so the evolution from there gets, it gets a bit complicated because Intel changed the way these features are implemented, like to what degree these features are implemented and so on. So with the Intel P6-based processors, like the Pentium Pro, the Pentium 2, the Pentium 2 Xeons, the Pentium 3s. So in these Pentium P6-based architectures, you have 2 40-bit PMCs. And on the Intel NetBurst-based architectures, you get 18 40-bit PMCs. And then at some point, Intel basically changed to have fixed function and programmable function PMCs as well. Now on the Atom, you get 2 programmable PMCs, which basically can be programmed to monitor different performance events. And you get 3 fixed function counters. So there is some variation in the silicon implementation of these things. So this feature set is not consistent across all the Intel hardware. So when you're implementing some of these things, you need to take into account which actual hardware you're running on, which CPU you're running on, and then query the CPU to see what features are available to you, and start using the features, the performance monitoring features that are present in that CPU. So in general, the performance monitoring counters can monitor 2 main categories of things in terms of the performance events as well as the event duration. So in terms of events, there's, like these days, there's so many events. So you really need to look in the manual for a description of all the events that are available for any microarchitecture that you're interested in. But in general, what Intel has done these days is that there is a set of performance events that can be used with PMCs that are considered architectural events. So these are essentially part of the architecture and not considered model-specific anymore. So the idea is that the architectural events are meant to be a lot more consistent than model-specific events. But even architectural events, there's Intel does give you a mechanism to see which architectural events are available on a given microarchitecture. So it is not still a solid target, it's still a moving target because Intel keeps on adding to this. There's I think the current performance monitoring version is like version 4, so there is variation. And with the newer CPUs, you have a lot of model-specific performance events that you can monitor, and some of these things are really cool. Like some of these things are really low-level cool stuff. Like for example, one of the useful ones is like branch misprediction. So where the branch predictor fails to predict branches, that you can get a performance event based on that. So things like this. Now, what other things are available? You can have number of instructions decoded, the number of interrupts received, number of cache loads, number of cache misses, and all these things are available to you. And these things are not really available by any other means to directly have this information without using the CPU performance counters from stock software that is running on the system. And another really cool feature is that you can actually have a performance monitoring interrupt that will be triggered when a certain condition is met when it comes to a given performance event. So you can basically set up a count and say, I want the CPU to be interrupted every time n number of performance monitoring events of this description has taken place. So for our purposes, the PMI mechanism is actually quite useful. So just quickly, the relevant control registers for setting these up is CR0 and CR4. I'm not going to go into the details of it. It's in the manuals. It's just a screenshot from the manuals. And quickly, the CR4 contains like basically the protection enable flag, and basically that allows us to set the processor modes. And in basically the protected mode, the CR4 contains the bits that to enable the performance monitoring events. So the bit 8 of the CR4, which enables the RDPC instruction, and this basically means that this instruction is available at any protection level. You can change this bit, and you can make it such that if it is used in a non-privileged level, say from anything under CPL0, you will basically get a fault, and that can be tracked to see if RDPMC was used by unprivileged software. So this is usually like, if you set this up, you can basically define how RDPMC behaves, and you can use it for various different things. And the timestamp counter disable bit is basically a bit that is that limits how RDTSC instruction can be used. And by using this, we can again receive a fault when RDTSC is used and basically intercept it and do things. So that becomes useful as well. So this is a description of the RDPMC instruction. And do you want to go into it, or shall we just refer to the manual?
Yeah, refer to the manual.
Okay, because we've got a fair bit of material to cover, so we're not going to get into the specifics of using the RDPMC instruction, but I'll quickly say, so basically, it's a simple CPU instruction where you basically tell it which monitor that you want to read, and it'll give you the count in that monitor counter. So it's a fairly easy instruction, and then there are certain things like high resolution reads, low resolution reads, and all that, but I mean, all this information is in the manual. I'm sorry that we can't go to it because we want to make sure that we cover pretty much all the stuff that we have to cover. So basically, like I said before, you specify an index, and there's slight differences between how the results are returned in 64-bit mode and 32-bit mode, but yeah, just everything is basically in the manuals. And RDTSC is basically, there's no indexing or anything. RDTSC is to read the timestamp counter, so you call the instruction and the results are returned in EDX-EX. And again, 64-bit, it's basically returning the same result, but in a slightly different register format. So like this, yeah. Okay, so now going back to figuring out what PMC information is available to us on a given microarchitecture, we can use a CPU ID instruction, and CPU ID instruction provides different leaves that give you different information about the process. So this is the leaf OXA, and this is how what the basic information that they return in terms of all the different things related to the performance monitoring. And again, you can go and have a look at the manual, and it'll give you a clear idea of what information you can get and how you can get it and how you can determine which events are supported and how you can use it. So the specific part of the manuals for this particular information, in terms of the monitoring events themselves, is in Chapter 19, Performance Monitoring Events, in the Volume 3, which is the System Programming Guide. And they basically document all the events that are available. So there's massive tables of all events and listings of it. So unfortunately, in the manuals, they don't really go into the specificities of each of the events. They just give you a short enough description, and that should give you enough information to make an inference as to what it is doing and how it, and then work on that and see what it's useful for. Okay, so in terms of how this all comes together in a runtime setting, is when after the CPU is reset, all the programming counters are basically reset to 0, and all the programming counters are disabled by control register being disabled and cleared and reset to 0. And so this is the kind of state that the CPU is in after it reset. So to set it up, to set up the PMCs to record events, we need to take certain steps. So I'll quickly run down through the steps so you get a rough idea of the workflow. So basically, to set up PMCs to record events, first of all, we can either disable all counting or selectively reset the counters by selecting the control register to disable the particular counter. So basically, you can do this by setting IA32 perf global control MSR to 0, or reset individual event selectors for each register. So for the performance counters, you get the event selector and the event counters. So by controlling the event selector, by setting it to 0, you can disable the counting. And basically, if you're using the technique or the method I was describing before, where the CPU is interrupted when certain amount of performance events have been generated, that is, they call it the PEBS, which is a precision event-based sampling. So to do PEBS, we basically set so for each PMC register, performance control register that we want to use, we basically set the number of events as a negative value after which we need the interrupt to occur. So the interrupt occurs at overflow. So if you set a negative value, after that many number of events, when the register turns to 0, you'll get an interrupt. So basically, that's the performance monitoring interrupt. So to use the PEBS, we have to hook the PMI interrupt and set up our own ISR, interrupt service routine. So like most operating systems will provide you the functionality to basically set up your own ISR. And in Windows, there's an undocumented HAL function, and that HAL function can be used to basically set up the ISR for PEBS. And if you wanted to do it bare metal, you can basically set up the appropriate local vector table entry in the epic and hook the IDT entry for what you have set up in the epic already. And in Windows, the ISR there's a very specific ISR for the PMI event, which is the HAL P perf interrupt. So technically, you can use this to maybe brute force the ISR that is actually mapped for this particular interrupt, because you know what the OS likes to set it to. So once if you use PBS, if you have set the ISR, now to start recording events, all you need to do is that for each performance monitoring counter, there's 2 registers. One is the event selector and one is the count itself. So basically, you need to set up the performance event selector for the relevant counter, and this can be set up to instruct the CPU that which type of events you want to monitor with this particular counter. And basically, it can be, so you have what is called an event select and unit mask, and this is all documented in the Intel documentation. So for each event, you figure out what UMask you want and what is the event select event ID, and then you set it up, and that's how you set up the PMC to detect the event that you want. And to start recording events, once the event select is set up, you have to set up the enable bit for that particular event select, and then you had also make sure that the perf global control is enabled. And when you're done recording events, you set the perf global control to 0, so the performance collecting events turn to 0, and all the PMC counter registers, you can basically reset them. And basically, you also need to clean up the ISR that you have set up if you're using PEBS. So how well does the PMCs perform? I mean, clearly it's quite powerful. What is the performance impact? Well, using this mechanism is virtually free, really, because it's implemented in Silicon, and other than interrupt latencies and things like that, it is largely, well, for lack of a better word, free, really. There are obviously instruction timings and whatnot that come into play. Like, for example, on some processors, doing a 40-bit fast read of a counter is actually faster than doing a 48-bit read. But, I mean, there are very minimal performance impact in terms of actually using it in real-life scenarios. I mean, obviously, if you were polling it, like, excessively, it'll, compared to what else that you're doing, it will have an impact, but realistically, for real-life use cases, it is quite low cost depending on how you go about doing things. So it can be free, almost. And with the interrupts, you can get the incidence count, obviously, and you can also see the duration between two events if you wanted to. And so in terms of the cost of using the PEBS system, the user mode cost of receiving this interrupt could be like 500 nanoseconds plus, and the event processing cost, as in like your decision making after you have seen this event, is on top of that. So you're okay.
So we have different incidence count for different types of events. So what we did, we timed for about 30 seconds of different kinds of activities. And if you use all micro ops counter, you get billions. So doing an interrupt on every one of these will surely slow you down. If you take something like return misses, that is when the return instruction is falsely predicted by the CPU, then you get about 400,000 in 30 seconds. And this, what we tested was in a bad case scenario where we forced the CPU to do task switching. Task switching causes return misses because the internal shadow stack is invalidated when you switch to another task. Obviously, the list of returns that are supposed to take and is no longer valid for the other task. So it's not too bad with return misses. Another particular event that we think are particularly interesting is last level cache misses. This is when the cache memory access is not found in the last level of caching, typically level 3, but on some CPUs it could be level 2. You get around 10 to the 9th events if you're RowHammering. If your computer is idle, we are talking about 100,000. So there is no such thing as free lunch. You can't call the interrupt on every event, but you can use the interrupt accordingly to the event you're actually logging to get more information.
So using the interrupt on every event is unlikely to be a reasonable strategy.
Can I take this?
Okay. So to minimize the performance penalties that we are talking about, here are some ideas in terms of when you put some of these things together, how we can minimize the performance impact of using these things. So basically, we can use probabilistic detection and mitigation, and basically use the trigger count on the interrupt rather than counting every event. And basically that way, the actual processing cost will be basically segmented into the number of event parcels that you're discussing. And we can also limit this to particular CPU ring levels, so like the ring 0 or ring 3 between unprivileged and privileged code. So by limiting this scope, we can basically limit the number of events and therefore reduce the performance penalties. And we can also do this on a process-specific level. So we can basically use this to only monitor the code execution statistics generated when a certain process is the current process that is active. So this could be used as well for only like high impact processes. And you can also set this up so that it can be evaluated or triggered only at certain points in the system's operation, not all the time. And you can also add things in compile time that basically allows you to generate statistics on what those things you added in the compile time generated. So this is also a good, an interesting way to start using this in a more performance-wise acceptable fashion. Like the idea is that rather than looking for something that's already happening, you can instrument the program at compile time so that the generated code will be generating events that are visible with PNCs that you can look for them. And in runtime, we can do it by installing type of instrumentation or hooks at certain points in the OS functioning, and we can evaluate at those certain points. And generally when you're using processing that is costly, it is better to do that on rarer events rather than on more frequent events, obviously.
Okay, I just wanted to say that we will return to the topics in this slide again and again over the rest of this talk.
Yeah.
So if you remember one slide, this one is it.
Okay, so basically we are going to briefly look at what kind of ROP mitigations that can be used. And to give an idea of ROP, I don't really want to get into this too much, but I mean, I'm sure you guys are familiar with ROP. So ROP is generally basically generalized return to libc. I mean, like we didn't have ROP when we were growing up. It used to be called return to libc, and ROP is a more generalized version of it. And basically, what ROP does is that it circumvents dead execution prevention of data areas where executable code can't execute from data areas. And so the first line of defense against ROP is basically SLR, where they basically change things around in the address space, so you don't really know where to return to. And now the thing with SLR is that it can be defeated in many ways under the right circumstances. And info leaks can be quite handy in this sort of thing. So SLRs are not really it raises the bar, but it doesn't solve the problem entirely. And with ROP, there are other schemes like jump-oriented programming, basically call-oriented programming. We're using indirect calls, or the counterfeit object-oriented programming, where you're basically using the features, the memory representation of objects to set up a similar state machine. So now, yeah.
We need to speed up.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of ROP detection, some of the more interesting stuff is done by these guys, which is basically, they call it K-Bouncer. They basically won the Microsoft Blue Hat Challenge for this. So what it basically does is that they did the proof of concept on Windows Professional Service Pack 1. And what it does is it uses the last branch recording, or the LBR stack in Intel CPUs. And basically what it does is that it intercepts certain key system calls, and at the point of the system in user mode, and when the API calls is intercepted, at that point they will basically issue an RTL to their driver to read the performance events in kernel mode. Basically, in this case, the LBR stack, which is a stack of the last 16 branches recorded, and then it will see if the last 16 branches recorded is consistent with the standard call flow for that particular API, or whether it was highly deviating from that.
A comment here. They are using user mode hooks to install this.
Yep.
And this is a particular case of what we call instrumentation. They use this technique to get by that the stack of the LBR is only 16 large. Mm-hmm. So if you can log it globally, you will get nothing. So this is a way you can use instrumentation to get specific data out.
Yeah, so going back to that point where we were talking about how to optimize on our usage, here they're basically instrumenting critical points in the OS, where at these points you inspect to see if the call flow to that point, within limitations obviously of the 16 large stack, that it is consistent with the call flow that is usually meant to get there. And this one is an interesting one by Georg Wojcicki. This is a US patent from CrowdStrike. And basically what they're doing here for rub detection is that they're using the performance measuring counters from ring 0, and they're looking for the red misses that we were talking about. So red misses is basically when the return address is mispredicted by the CPU. And in case of something like ROP, you are likely to get red misses because the addresses that you're returning to in a ROP setting are not usual addresses that are returned to. They're basically different addresses of gadgets. So the prediction in this case, it's the CPU will not have predicted these things beforehand to these things occurring, because in the normal operation of the CPU, or normal operation of code, it's not really returned to these points at all. So you don't return, like normally, you don't return to the gadgets directly in the normal operation of the CPU or the OS.
So this is an example of using limitation to ring 0 to get somewhere. I talked a bit about before that return misses are made difficult by task switches. This is a way to eliminate this problem by limiting the scope using ring 0. I think before we proceed, I'll just say you could actually use the instrumentation method that K-bounds are used to do the same thing for user mode if you wish to do so. The advantage of doing that with the normal performance counters is that you get a much deeper stack than 16. Okay, so if you wish to do a stack of 200, you have no issue. You just need to instrumentalize like you're doing with K-bouncer.
Yeah. So again, like K-bouncer is using the LBR stack. Like what Anders is basically discussing was how we can use PMCs as well for the same purpose, but done slightly different to K-bouncer. Okay, so basically that's roughly a basic idea of what people have done with ROP mitigation, and especially the first approach using LBR and second approach using ROPs. Now, I've seen some other people do, I mean, I mentioned it here, but they have done some stack pivoting detection and things like that as well, using as a defense against ROPing, and they've done it using PMCs as well. So these are not obviously the only ways you can use PMCs. There's some scope there. It was just something that we want to mention as examples, and it's unlikely to be by far the only things that you can do. And so, like before we move on, do you have anything to add before we? Okay. So now we are going to start. We're going to look at how we can mitigate a low-level problem like RowHammer using the performance counters. So basically, the RowHammer stuff is based on some of the original research that was published in this paper about bit flipping in DDR3 RAM. And you can refer to the original paper. They have quite a significant discussion there. And then Mark Seaborn and Thomas Lin, who happen to be giving their RowHammer talk right around now in a different room, basically exploited this, and I believe they basically modified the PTEs using bit flipping in RowHammer to gain kernel mode, and and then quite recently there was a JavaScript implementation that basically exploited the RowHammer from JavaScript. And sorry, we're going to have to really speed up, I think. So I don't think we'll really have any time to go into discussing this. But the bottom line is that with DDR3 memory, if you read like basically the same memory, like a memory address fast enough, then you can basically cause bit flips in adjacent memory in the same memory chip itself. So that's basically the whole point of RowHammer. So you keep on hitting the same memory address and cause bit flips in other addresses in the same proximity. So that's basically a discussion into how the DDR is set up and all these things. So quickly, for memory access in DDR3, so basically you transfer the data in a memory line into a row buffer, and that basically discharges the row. And then basically you read or write the row buffer contents, which is basically accessing the values in the RAM, and then when you copy back the buffer contents of the raw buffer into the memory gets recharged again. And since the charge doesn't stay forever, you have at every refresh interval, the memory controller will refresh the contents to make sure that the content remains consistent. So this is basically the code that they published to trigger RowHammer, and I probably wouldn't go into that.
I think we should talk a little bit about refresh rate. As I said, memory degrades with time, and to avoid the bits flip automatically, DDR RAM refreshes itself on a refresh interval. The default is 64 milliseconds, and you can, yeah. So I think this is important because...
Yes, this is important because we like to basically cause the bit flips. You have to basically hammer within that refresh interval, otherwise the memory gets refreshed again. So it has to occur within that refresh interval. And so in general, memory is most likely to increase in density. So basically, and the magnetic field properties are that it's inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So as memory gets more dense, this type of electrical disturbance issues are likely to be more and more prominent. And with mobile devices where there's smaller form factor and they're going into higher and higher memory, so there's likely to have similar issues like RowHammer affecting these things in the future as well. So in Inertial, to basically cause RowHammer issues, you basically have to read a lot of physical memory from RAM, which means that you have to bypass any CPU caching. And so you're going to read fast before the DRAM refreshes, so between a refresh interval. And then you need to know which memory address to read to cause the bit flips in adjacent memory in areas that are significant in terms of crossing privilege boundaries. And basically, what the Google guys did was that they did what is called double-sided row hammering, where they were actually using, like, attacking two memory lines where they were flipping the one in the middle. And obviously the vulnerable DRAM modules.
Well, before we go on from this slide, I'd like to notice that all mitigations that I've so far seen can be plotted into the matrix that is listed here. It works by denying either one of these points on the list or more of them.
Yep.
Ours as well.
Yes. Okay, so this is basically original source documentation that you can have a look at, and some testers that tested for RowHammer. This one is quite interesting because it's a JavaScript implementation. And so basically what some of the ideas that came out was that because this is physical flow, that this can't be mitigated or dealt with in software, which we like to disagree with, because we can address it at least to a large degree by software-only means. One of the other things that came up as a solution was to increase the refresh rate, but this has problems. If you look at the original paper states that the refresh rate has to be something like 8 milliseconds to completely rule out any RowHammer type problems, so it's not the ultimate solution. And basically, increasing the refresh rate is costly in terms of power and in terms of performance, because when you refresh memory for that period in time, you can't actually read the contents, and which increases power consumption. So this was something that was for DDR4 specification, something that was basically proposed as an algorithm that can be implemented at the DRAM level to...
The idea is if you read a lot from a particular place in memory, you cause a refresh of that piece of memory so that refresh time is faster.
I'll quickly go through these slides. Okay, so one of the mitigation methods they were talking about in terms of first, one of the things being talked about was to disable flushing the cache, so that because if for RowHammer you had to read physical memory, so if the memory is cached, well then you're not reading from the physical memory, you're reading from the cache. So CL flushing is an instruction on the x86 architecture or x64 architecture that allows you to do this. And the thing is that the CL flush is not necessarily needed. So the solution which works with CL flush is not really that useful in the greatest sense of things, because you can work around it. And like these are some of the other ways that you can flush the cache. So I won't really get into that, but like basically ECC DRAM was offered as a solution, but I mean ECC DRAM, even if it was practical for everybody to use, ECC DRAM doesn't actually detect all multiple bit flip errors.
Yeah, one other way of mitigating RowHammer is to make sure that you cannot find the physical address of the victim address where you need to flip bits to gain higher security privilege. And this is good because it's a need-to-know basis. Linux have removed the physical mappings for access for user mode applications.
Yeah. Well, this is specifically finding out because one of the, like, I mean, this is obviously not the only way to cross privilege boundaries, but in the original one of the exploits, what the guys did was that they basically modified the page table entries to go into kernel mode. So basically what we are doing, like basically our solution to detecting and mitigating RowHammer is to basically detect the LSC cache misses, because when the data in the cache is evicted or it is flushed to directly access the RAM, we generate a performance monitoring event, which is a low-level cache miss. So in terms of using this method, you can run with or without an interrupt really, and you can look for peaks of LSC misses within a refresh interval, because RowHammering has to happen in the refresh interval. And to minimize performance cost, you can apply it on a sandbox only, or for relevant processes, or in user mode only. And so there could be potential false positives, but in some ways you'll see how the potential false positives are not necessarily that relevant. And well, if the exploit is successful, or potentially we have detected such an attempt, we can possibly shut down the attempt. In terms of mitigation, basically we have two mitigation methods. One is blind mitigation and one is mitigation through identification. So this blind mitigation is actually one of those areas where we talked about, like, there's no problem of not like detecting it wrongly in terms of false positives, because what we're doing is that when we have an attempt, with what looks like a RowHammering attempt, what we do is we introduce a delay to that offending thread such that any other attempt to keep on doing it will go out of the refresh interval. So the hammering won't happen within the same refresh interval, because we'll be progressively introducing delays.
The basic idea is back to the slide I said that was important. We use one performance counter in rare events, say every 10,000 cache meshes. And if that happens twice, very short periods of time, we up the ante and look at more. So we add to the performance penalty, and we do this successively until we bog down the memory reads so that the next refresh interval will arrive in the memory.
Yeah. So the hammering will cross the refresh interval, and it won't be sufficient hammering to cause a problem. And so basically mitigation through identification is essentially, we are talking about the same method, but we're talking about mitigating once we see such an attempt by introducing a delay at the right place or reading that address to cause a refresh. And sorry we had to rush through this because we need to go through all the slides, or well, at least some of them. So basically to disrupt this, what we're going to do, if we see an attempt that looks like a RowHammer event, we will read data at this victim memory address, and that way the memory will get refreshed, and any RowHammering attempt will have to start over again from that point onwards. So, and this way the false positives are quite unlikely. And you want to talk about the rootkit stuff really quickly?
First, we have to differentiate between two kinds of rootkits. There is what I call the well-behaved kind of rootkits. Those are rootkits that basically load a driver and execute nicely and well-behaved in this driver. The not so well-behaved rootkit is one that allocates itself memory and executes itself from that. This is not very well-behaved, and it's a great way to hide yourselves from scanning. We are not going to talk about the well-behaved rootkit. We're going to talk about the not so well-behaved rootkits. The idea here is any code that executes will trigger PMCs, and rootkits execute code. So with an interrupt on PMC overflow, we will automatically get an IEP or an RIP, and thus we know that code is being executed here. Then we can traverse all known modules and see if it's in those modules. If it's not, then we have a suspect. We think this might be a rootkit. A suspect can be dealt with by standard methods. The problem with just searching the RAM is it's quite possible to obfuscate memory. So you don't identify it as code. But when you actually have an interrupt there, you know that it's execution at this point.
Yeah, so generally the idea is that rather than looking for memory regions in memory which look like executable and seeing like what the content is in there, we look at the actual statistics about the code that actually executes and see if code is meant to be executing from these areas in general operation of the operating system. And if it is not, then there's something fishy going on there.
So a practical implementation, first we thought of all micro-ops, which just hits too often. We also tried instructions retired, which triggers a bit less. But we ended up using L2 cache misses. This is because they're much rarer than the instructions retired, but it's virtually impossible to avoid triggering L2 cache hits at some point. And also the relative performance penalty for using L2 cache meshes versus other things is that in loops, you tend to get that the cache will be loaded and we don't see the loop twice in the performance counting. So actual processing, we have deferred to another thread. So we just record that here was an event and pass it on to another thread and let it do standard testing for malware code. Obviously, we have false negative problems. We could identify any code execution outside of kernel mode and inside of kernel mode as well. The problem is that execution out of modules in user mode is quite common, so we have too many false positives, false negatives, and it's also a performance problem. Also, we realize that it's only probabilistic detection. There is no way to guarantee that a rootkit will actually trigger one of these things. However, it is unlikely that any rootkit actually doing something will survive a year without being detected with this method. Also, there is a chance that critical areas, say true type font processing, could be instrumented to be more rigorously tested. We have not done this, but you have the option. That means that basically any kind of overflow here would be outside of a module, and we will trigger and find out that it potentially. As an example, the much hyped equation group Greyfish uses a hash 1,000 times to find a key before decrypting more code. We think that might trigger an interrupt at some point, right? Yes.
By the way, the sarcasm, as far as equation group stuff goes, I mean, some of that stuff, especially with the hard drive firmware modification stuff, is very cool. So if anyone in the audience was an author of that, no offense meant.
Well, we have another problem. The problem is that we need a list of known good drivers, type, true type fonts, etc. It is strictly required. If we don't have such a list, it doesn't work. And this is feasible only in kernel mode. In user mode, there's just too much code around, and we can't do it. Also, in user mode, you have things like JIT compilers, and this is probably very rare in kernel mode, I hope. From the point that we have detected code usage outside of known good areas, traditional analysis will have to take over to check if this is really a rootkit. And the questions you can ask yourself is, does this code use stealth technology? Do you have like delta offset technology where the code can run in any location in memory? You could have known good signatures to sort out false positives further. You could also have known bad signatures, standard antivirus stuff. So obviously our method can be defeated. We're not the only client using the PMC, so other rootkits could override our PMC usage. However, the RDTSC instruction might statistically tell on the attackers turning off the PMC, so we might actually know if somebody is trying to detect us or avoid detection by these means.
And we might actually get a chance to check the MSRs detected that way as well. And also PMC virtualization by VMMs add another layer of complexity to the whole process. So obviously we won't have any time to cover the cache side channel attacks. So that'll have to wait for another conference, but the slides will be available on the website, so you guys can go through it. We have, and generally the slides should give you a rough idea as to what we were going to discuss. So if there are any questions at this point, I'd like to take a quick question if there is one or two. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions, so you can do a couple of slides of cache side channel attacks then.
Okay, the idea behind cache attacks is that the third level cache is shared on all cores and all virtual threads, or hyperthreading. And that means that accessing memory from one core will be able to be spotted in another core because the latency, because it's placed into cache by the first core, the second core will be able to see this because memory access is faster. So measure the time for accessing the memory. You can know if a victim used a certain address. So basically the flush and reload attack is you flush a memory address and you wait a second and then you try to read it, and if the read is fast, somebody else used this memory, and if the read is slow, nobody used it. So you get information about other processes and other privilege levels outside of the sandbox.
Outside of the VM sometimes maybe. And yeah, so basically that's the kind of information you can gather by cache side channel attacks, and we're basically using PMCs, you can address them to some degree as well. How are we doing for time, by the way? Are we? Yeah, okay. So we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're obviously out of time.
So summing it up very quickly, I think we have shown that performance counters can actually say a lot about things that are going on inside the CPU that are not normal and is directly related to malicious activity.
Or at least abnormal activity, in the very least. And so in some cases, directly malicious activity, like, for example, like in case like RowHammer. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry that we couldn't get through all the slides, but we'll put the slides up on the website. I'm sure it'll come on like in the next couple of days. So you can go through the slides, and that should give you a rough idea of what we're going to talk about. So thank you very much.